and let me start this off by telling you that this title is Coping with Climate Change, and actually it's divided into two parts. We're going to talk about the climate variability aspect to start with, and then the second part will actually talk about weatherproofing your farming systems and everything else. Design this in such a way that you don't have to wait until the end to ask questions. I do have to leave because I have a commitment with the Soybean Association tomorrow in Peoria as well, and you really don't want my travel agent right now, let me tell you that, in terms of the schedule that I've got. So we are going to talk about this in many different forms and fashions as we go through this. Like I said, if you've got a question, don't wait till the end to bring it up. Let's talk about it right there, because I can deviate many different ways. And let me also, this piece is here, and I put my contact information on there for you for a couple different reasons. One is it saves me a whole lot of business cards. The other one is that we do cover, or I do cover a lot of material in this, and at times you go away and you think about that material, and all of a sudden, about a week later, you've got this question, and you can have that opportunity to either call me or send me an email and say what's going on. There is one additional piece in there. I now have a new title in addition to Laboratory Director. I also direct the Midwest Climate Hub. And the Climate Hubs were announced about a month ago. They're an initiative by the administration to begin to deliver information to producers on climate impacts on agriculture and how do we really manage the overall system in terms of coping with climate. And in the Midwest is basically the Corn Belt, if you want to think about it this way. North Dakota is actually in the Northern Plains climate hub. So it means I just didn't have enough to do, so they gave me another job along the way. Is really what that meant in there. But I am serious about the aspect. If you've got questions, to give me a call or send me an email, everything else. So let's talk about this, and here's the outline for the day. Part one and part two. Part one, I'm going to talk about the current state of climate. And if you've been through this winter, you can say, well, current state of climate sucks. You know, I really don't want to see this again. And then we'll talk a little bit about the impacts on agriculture from that. Part two, we're going to talk about maintaining agricultural productivity, and finally about weatherproofing your farming system. And I'll give you the bottom line right now. Weatherproofing your farming system is going to come through soil management. It's going to come through an aspect of improving your soils to be able to manage water, to manage the nutrient cycling, to allow the genetics to express themselves differently. It's not a matter of controlling the weather. It's really about managing your soils as part of this. That's a big key to weatherproofing our cropping systems. And that's a different tangent than most of the people that would ever talk about this. But I'm more and more convinced that we have really ignored the whole aspect that soil and water management are the key to understanding what we have in terms of climate variation out there, really in particular of agricultural systems anyway. So we'll talk about that. That kind of gives you the bottom line. You'll hear me throughout the day talk about this whole concept of G by E by M. G by E by M is genetics by environment by management. How do we get the genetics? How do we couple those with environment? And you have a major role to play in terms of the management piece of this. Too often and throughout agronomic history, what we focused on is G by E, the genetics by environment interactions. But in reality, there is a lot more aspect in terms of the management piece that we need to understand. And those offer some real potentials for us along the way. So you'll see some of that come through as we talk about these different things. So the way that I've been thinking about this, and let me give you a little more background on this overall aspect of what I've been doing for the last, Mike says 5 years since I was been here, is that in addition to all these other things, is I do lead USDA's effort in terms of the assessment of climate impacts on agriculture. And so for the last 5-6 years, I spent a great deal of time and energy evaluating climate impacts on agriculture, not only for the U.S. but on a world basis, and looking and saying, what do we have today? What are we going to have tomorrow? How's that all putting together? How do we develop indicators for climate response or agricultural response to climate as well as weather? And weather being the short term, climate being the longer term that we need to think about planning for. And so all of those pieces, I spent a great deal of time looking at, bringing together, assembling information along the way, and in doing so, one of the things that has really come very clear when you start looking at all the different pieces of information that's out there is that here's the things that limit us in terms of yield. Obviously water is at the top of that list in terms of the yield limitation. Temperature is a limitation in terms of where we grow and how crops express themselves. We get into one that people often don't consider, and that's the role of oxygen. It's part of the root system, and we see this particularly in flooded soils, and too often in the spring, oxygen is a limitation to us. Solar radiation is actually a limitation at times. Ozone, and that's not so much a problem for this area of the country but if we start moving into the eastern corn belt, into the eastern part of the United States, ozone actually becomes a limitation because those ozone levels are still tending to increase, and they do influence a lot of our crops. Then we get down to other things that are limitations, obviously nutrients, and it's not only just phosphorus, potassium, nitrogen, but there's a lot of other things. We're seeing great responses to sulfur now, particularly in the more humid areas, because we've taken and reduced sulfur content going out of any of our coal-fired plants, and so now we have less sulfur deposition, and so now we're seeing sulfur deficiencies in our soils. The biggest one, and let me put it this way, that the impacts from diseases and insects, weeds, in terms of economic impacts, basically are about equal to the weather impacts, and sometimes bigger from that perspective. The other one that I put out there as a yield limitation is inappropriate agronomic practices. And these are things that you can put in the category of let's hurry up and get it done, but there's an impact to that. One of those hurry up and get it done things is sometimes we plant a field that's a little bit too wet. We end up with sidewall compaction. We create compaction in that basically creates a compaction zone that influences that plant throughout the whole year. And so that becomes an issue in this, a number of different things. And then finally, I think one of the major limitations is the fact that we've failed to realize or understand these interactions between the genetics, the environment, and the management. And that's not your fault. That's really, I think, a fault of science because we haven't focused enough on just how these pieces really fit together. We do a lot of talking about agronomic systems and systems development and things like this, but as more and more I look through the literature and spend a lot of time looking at that, is that we've really failed to understand some of these pieces and how they really all fit together from a standpoint of what it takes to not only maintain our yield potential, but to realize that yield potential throughout the whole growing season. And so there's just a great avenue potential areas that we can have a major impact on productivity. But I can't make it rain. All right? In spite of all these other things, if it doesn't rain in rain-fed environments, we have a problem. And so that's why this whole thing in terms of managing that soil to hold as much water as possible becomes the full circle in terms of this process. So you hear these things again and again, and it was very important that we started out by saying, you know, what are those things that limit us, so that you can understand the context of how we think about a number of these different pieces of this puzzle. And in doing so, what we really come up with is this sort of approach, and just begin to think about, you know, how these pieces fit together. The big four that influence plant growth are temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, and carbon dioxide. And those are direct impacts. They influence the growth, they influence the phenology of that plant, and they influence yield. And what we'll do is we'll weave the story together when we talk about some of these climate impacts this morning, is to show how all that fits together. In the growth aspect, obviously, carbon dioxide, as you'll see, is a major impact on this. We do change the phenology of these plants by the temperature regime that they're in. All of that translates to yield. But the flip side of that is that temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, carbon dioxide also influences the growth of insects, diseases, and weeds. And those are the indirect impacts, because those are the things that circle around and get us from that side. And underlying all of this is the soil. The soil is this underlying factor, because in rain-fed agriculture, and even in irrigated agriculture, it's our reservoir for nutrients and water. And so the soil becomes an important foundation in all of this aspect of what's going on. And so you have the direct impacts, you have the indirect impacts. All of those are going on simultaneously throughout the year. And one of the things, if you look at this, we really have not understood the indirect impacts very much at all. They're probably our greatest frontier in understanding how all of these things fit together. And in reality, the temperature, precipitation, solar radiation, the interactions of those things are not as well understood as they might be either. Here, and we'll just kind of start walking through this process along the way. So that's kind of a long general introduction to this, but here's our CO2, methane and nitrous oxide concentrations in the atmosphere. Right now our CO2 concentration is somewhere around 390. Let me put it in perspective for you. When I started working on my PhD in the early 70s, CO2 concentrations were about 325 parts per million. So over the course of my career, we've gone from 325 to about 390 parts per million. It's not a big deal for plants. Plants love CO2. You know, and so from a plant perspective, their attitude with relative to CO2 in the atmosphere is, bring it on. We like CO2, and so it's a positive for them. I'll give you an example of this, but I'm going to do it from a different perspective. Increasing CO2 increases plant growth. You see that. And there's a difference between C3 and C4 plants. C3 plants, things like wheat, soybeans, canola, are all C3. C4 is corn. Sorghum is a C4. It basically is the internal metabolism of that plant. And what we see in corn canopies is that corn canopies are so efficient in extracting CO2 out of the atmosphere that the atmospheric concentration could be in the order of 400 to 500 parts per million in the morning because of the respiration at night. And by 9 o'clock in the morning, that atmospheric concentration will be 290 parts per million, which is about the internal concentration within the leaf. And so that plant will have extracted everything out of the atmosphere around it, and it's just kind of working along at that point. As we increase CO2 and we increase the effect on plant development, we do increase water use efficiency. CO2 goes into that leaf through the stomates, water leaves by the stomates. And so the more efficient we can make that plant in terms of growth, we get more growth per unit of water transpired. So there's actually a benefit to increasing CO2, particularly in environments like North Dakota, South Dakota, anything that's more humid, is because we get more growth per unit of water that transpired. So again, that's another positive of CO2 in this. And so all of these things are happening to us as part of this. So from that standpoint, it's really not a bad thing in terms of the overall processes that are going on. And we can delve into all the physiology of this, but in reality, those are the things that are happening in the background. I thought I'd explain CO2 responses from a different perspective because the more fascinating aspects of CO2 is what's been done in terms of looking at CO2 effects on weeds. And this happens to be Canada thistle. This is some of the work that Lou Ziska has done out of Beltsville. The chamber on the left is a ambient CO2 level. Chamber on the right is basically about 650 parts per million when he did this study. And what that Canadian thistle has been sprayed with Roundup. Under future CO2 levels, it takes 16 times as much Roundup to control Canada thistle as it does under the CO2 concentrations that are typical today. So weeds are going to become a lot more difficult to control. Go back to that changing metabolism, changing growth aspect. All of this is that weeds are showing this tremendous positive response to increasing CO2. In fact, these next two graphs show that. And you all recognize these 6 weeds as being pretty invasive species. And this has been the growth response when the CO2 has been changed from 300 to 380 parts per million. Say it's 1960s to what it is right now. Canada thistle is about 175% increase in growth. More than almost a threefold increase. Sow thistle, star thistle, leafy spurge. Leafy spurge almost doubled. Field bindweed doubled. Spotted knapweed almost doubled. These plants, weeds have basically doubled in size and doubled in growth because of the increasing CO2. Invasive species have shown a lot more positive response to increasing CO2, and that's why they've become more invasive over the past few years, is because they just really figured out. We have yet to have an agronomic problem that is showing this level of response. And so that's pretty interesting when you think about it. And so you go out there and you're thinking, you know, it's harder and harder to control those weeds, a number of different things are going on. Blame it on the fact that the CO2 levels are getting higher in the atmosphere. And those plants, because they have an enhanced metabolism because of the increased CO2, can metabolize most of the herbicides a lot more effectively than anything else. And so your bit of trivia for the day is there are 2 plants that have actually shown even more response than this. And those 2 plants are poison ivy and poison oak. Poison ivy and poison oak have become orders of magnitude more toxic in the toxin that's in those leaves over the past few years because of the increasing CO2 levels than anything else. And so people who are allergic to poison ivy, just merely coming in minor contact with that leaf will cause severe outbreaks of reaction compared to the same thing with poison oak. So all of these things are changing out there. So that is an aspect that's changing very dramatically.
Jerry, have you looked at water hemp and Palmer amaranth? Has anybody looked at that?
That's been one of the things that people are starting to look at in that is some of the herbicide resistance of Palmer amaranth and water hemp, just due to the fact that they're just showing a really positive response. And actually Lou Ziska is back working on some of that, and he actually is showing that he's got some really cool slides in terms of showing amaranth species that are basically trees in the field because of the increasing CO2. So a lot of those things, in fact, we have Palmer amaranth that has no longer have stems, they have trunks in terms of growth. And I'm sure you've seen some of those as well. And so some of that's responses, again, we believe is due to the CO2 levels in the atmosphere. So get a bigger axe in terms of how do we control those. The good news, however, is that we go forward with increasing CO2 levels, the weeds don't keep responding in that same level of increases. Lou actually ran a study in which he went from 380 to 720 parts per million. As we make those increases, leafy spurge only showed about a 25%. Canada Consistent was still about a 75% increase in growth. So it's very dramatic still if you think about the change that's out there. But it seems to be leveling off in terms of that response that's out there. In fact, we've just recently published a paper on soybeans in which we grew them at 800 parts per million CO2 levels. And they were beginning to show a growth decrease when we get the extremely high levels of CO2. Part of that is due to the fact that it's a decoupling of the nitrogen assimilation capacities within the leaves. A number of different things are happening in that. So the blanket statements that we used to make about increasing CO2 always being a positive could get to a point at which it does have a negative impact on plant development. And there's some very interesting physiology that goes with that. But 800 parts per million is not within my lifetime or your lifetime, and so I don't worry a whole lot about what's going to happen to agriculture at 800 parts per million CO2 levels. It's the nearer term that has an impact for us. But those are things that are occurring, and I think we need to understand. And in fact, we've seen this in rangeland studies where CO2 chambers have been put in. Is invasive species have become much more invasive, much more prevalent in stands because they outcompete the other species that are there. So we see these shifts in dynamics that are going on. Cheatgrass, for example, is another one that's responding very well, and so that's why it's become more prevalent over the past few years, probably 10 years. In terms of the change, just because of these things are happening to us. And so I think we need to understand those dynamics of what's going on and how we have to think about controlling it. So that's one of the best examples I've got of indirect impacts in agriculture. The other piece of this, and go back to the temperature effect, the temperature responses are very, very interesting. And we've spent a lot of time cataloging plant responses to temperature, and we use this one as a primary example of corn, soybeans, to dispel a couple different things. One is that optimum ranges of temperature for plant development and growth are different between the reproductive stage of development and the vegetative stage of development. Corn plants in particular tolerate much higher ranges of temperature during the vegetative stage of development as opposed to the reproductive stage. Corn really does not like it hot during the reproductive stage. In fact, it's detrimental, as I'll show you. There's also another point, there's a failure temperature. That failure temperature is 95 degrees, and that really refers to viability of pollen. And when pollen is being shed and the air temperature is 95 degrees, we can see a lot of sterility in that. And particularly if we've got dry atmospheric conditions, low humidities at that time, you think about the viability of that pollen from the time it goes from the tassels of that silk, which isn't very far. But if it's a hot, dry environment, that pollen grain can be sterile by the time it gets there. And so 95 degrees is kind of the tipping point. If it's moist, high humidities, you know, or the plant's water stressed as well, exaggerates that. The high humidities tend to decrease that effect. I'll give you an example of this, and it has nothing to do with Midwestern crops. It actually has to do with rice. Rice varieties in the Philippines, Japan, even some of those grown in California, were showing yield decreases with increasing temperature. And what they discovered is that the varieties that were showing a yield decrease were the ones that were pollinating during the middle of the day. That selecting for varieties that shed their pollen early in the morning when it was cooler began to have higher yields, showed less response to temperature, again, just when pollen shed was occurring. So you're talking about 6 hours difference in which pollen is being shed, but having a tremendous impact on productivity of that crop. So a lot of these things are very, very subtle in terms of the responses, but they fit within that context of what's going on in a given day. Soybeans, you know, they have an optimum temperature range for vegetative, and then they've got a slightly cooler range. Soybeans actually like it warmer during the reproductive stage than does corn. Soybeans will tolerate a lot higher temperatures during the reproductive stage than will corn. And so, you know, when we talk about soybeans and being able to produce a lot of that yield in August and September, it's the fact that they are tolerant to a lot of the conditions that causes corn to suffer a lot. So that's been very dramatic, and we'll show that in a little bit in all of these responses. But their failure temperature for that pollen is 102 degrees Fahrenheit, almost 7 degrees warmer than corn. So it'll tolerate, the pollen grain will even tolerate a higher temperature as well. So there's a lot of different things that happen in all of this. We spent a lot of time looking at these responses in this, looking at what's going to happen in the future, what's going to happen in all of this in terms of climate impacts on different crops. We've got the whole set developed for just about every crop that's growing out there. Because, and why we've done it is basically looking at what's going to happen in the future. By 2020, 2029, basically the next decade, when you think about this, 2020 is now only 6 years away. And we're talking about across the middle U.S., about 1.5 or about 3 degrees, 4 degrees Fahrenheit increase over this year, which is fairly dramatic. And B1 and A2 are just two different scenarios of what CO2 will look like in the future. In the near term, it doesn't have much of an impact. In the long term, it does have a lot of impact in terms of responses. And again, this is end of century sort of things, but you're talking about 5.5 degrees centigrade, which is about 12 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a dramatic change in terms of temperatures out there. But the surface temperatures, on a yearly basis, that's fairly dramatic. But let me dispel one aspect. When we talk about these types of changes in climate, I think the immediate assumption is that when we talk about increased temperatures and everything else, is that translates to warmer winters, warmer summers, and everybody always wants, you know, why are we having this extremely cold weather right now if the Earth is supposedly warming? Let me tell you that here's the real problem with climate change, is that the climate change that we're enduring is really about an aspect of increased variability in our climate. That if we look in the future, it's not this nice linear trend and everything else, but in actuality, the variability between the extremes is going to increase. And we've been through this before. You look back, the early 70s, when I was at Iowa State for the first time working on my PhD, it wasn't unusual to have daytime highs which rarely exceeded 0. You know, and then over that intervening period of time, we've gotten away from that, and everybody's growing accustomed to warmer temperatures. And so when we get winters like this, everybody just thinks the world has collapsed. But in reality, this is probably closer to a reality than is some of the warmer temperatures we see during the winter. Sorry to disappoint you, you know, and it's always have to dispel the fact that the upper Midwest is probably not going to grow bananas. But we have to. What we're going to have to be prepared in agriculture for is a much more of a variability, temperature extremes from one aspect to the other. Cold winters don't translate to cold summers. The correlation between a cold winter and a cool summer is almost 0 because of all of our climate patterns or energy exchange patterns that go on. So we're going to see on the mean average things begin to increase, but the variability about that number is also going to increase, which drives us crazy. And from a crop production side, which is what you guys are interested in, is that basically if we start seeing lots of changes in temperature, we can change planting dates, we can change tolerant varieties, which avoid exposure to high temperatures. So we basically shift it and we change our maturities, we can do that. But we also need to increase our soil water holding capacity to increase the available water. Because what we find is if a well-watered crop is much more able to handle temperature stresses than is a drought stress crop. Because leaf temperature does not equal air temperature. And you all know this, if you walk out there in a well-watered field in the middle of a hot day, those leaves are going to feel much cooler than air. And often they'll be 5 to 6 degrees cooler in this. And that's what makes those plants survive that. But if they don't have the water to transpire, their leaf temperature will not just be air temperature, it can be plus 2 or 3 degrees. And that's where we see a lot of physiological damage. The other part is these, and I'll bring back the home story on weeds, is that weed response under CO2 is going to give us additional challenges in management. You know, with the increasing invasiveness, a number of different things that go on, tolerance as well. Just give you an example of this from the summer of 2013, at least over central Iowa. 2013 was a schizophrenic year because we came out of the drought of 2012. We had very little water left in the profile. We went into March, early April, worrying about if we were going to have enough water to last the growing season. And then it turned off and it never quit raining until the middle of June. We went from famine to plus feast. we went from dry to flooding over that, and then we turned off the rainfall in the middle of June, and we went back into a drought for the rest of the year. A lot of soybeans were not planted until the latter part of June. In fact, we had a lot of soybeans were planted on the 20th, the 21st, 22nd of June, and started growing. They were about this tall. Producers did their normal thing of spraying with Roundup for weed control, and then began calling, because what happened is that those plants were trying to grow in a period in which we had rapidly diminishing water supplies, high temperatures, and those soybeans turned brown, because they typically do when we spray them with soybean or with Roundup, but because they're rapidly growing, they rapidly grow out of that. This year, because of the water stress, in 2013, because of water stress, they weren't able to get enough water to grow very fast, and so they remained brown for almost 2 weeks. I mean, a lot of those fields showed dramatic yield decreases because they just could not grow out of that quickly enough. So we ended up with a lot of very short beans in all of this. So one of the aspects that we're working on is how do we develop better short-term forecast as part of this climate hub. Climate hubs are really not about the 2050 scenario. It's about how do we get information for this year and thinking about whether that's a realistic trend or just a variation within a growing season. So I'm working on some pretty cool products. Hopefully they'll add value to agricultural systems. So temperatures are going to be a major problem, but we can handle that. The soil water is going to be an issue. We'll talk about that. This weed response is going to be an issue as well. Pests actually like temperatures as well. We've probably reduced our pest population over this winter. Anything that's in the soil, we've frozen pretty solid. So we probably will knock down some of those numbers this spring. But increasing temperatures, basically what we've seen is they expand the range of a lot of our overwintering pests. And so you're going to see that. Insects actually increasing variation in temperature and precipitation impact their whole cycles. Their phenological stages are a lot like crop stages. So the warmer it is, the faster they go through a lot of their stages. So we'll see more populations or more cycles within a growing season. And they're going to give us an additional stress on plants. So if you got changing temperature, you got changing moisture, and then you got the insect populations, is that what that really translates into is we're going to have to do a much better job of watching, scouting, understanding all these things that are happening in the field, because things I think are going to happen at different rates in a lot of different years, to understand some of those dynamics as well. And then the pathogens with increasing temperatures, that's one of the positive growths for a lot of our diseases, but also some of the increasing humidities add to that as well. So all of these things are going to happen simultaneously, and all I'm saying is that we really need to be prepared on how to watch our fields for a lot of the different things that are occurring out there. Because you all are going to outrun science in terms of this, because we can't run the studies fast enough to be able to capture all of those. So it's going to take a pretty unique combination as we go forward to understanding some of these dynamics. Here's a couple pieces that I just wanted to put out here for you. And we'll talk about this again in the precipitation, but the number of consecutive dry days is that we're going to think about increasing those. So what that really means is it's going to be longer between rain events. Our rains are, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but rain events are going to become less frequent, but they're going to become more intense. So that's one of the things that's also occurring in this variability cycle. So when it rains, it's going to rain a whole lot, and then it's going to be a lot less between rain events. The other thing is that we're going to see a change in the number of hot nights. There's one of the things that's occurring in the climate signal is that when we talk about this warming aspect of the atmosphere, that it's not our mean temperature. Our mean temperatures are changing, but it's not our maximum temperatures, it's our minimum temperatures. Our minimum temperatures are actually increasing much more than the maximums. And think about what happens on warm nights. You know, if you don't have air conditioning in your house, and a warm July night, and a warm, sticky July night, how comfortable are you? Not very, right? And so when you think about this from a standpoint of an animal, the animal metabolism, is that animals really suffer the most when we have the hot nights out there. We see our greatest mortalities of all of this. So the climate impacts on animal production are not well understood. And for one of the first times in the last few years in our climate assessment was we brought in the animal aspect of it. And here's what happens to animals and overexposure to hot nights, and you'll see this from when you talk about, you think about yourselves. The first night of exposure to a hot night is actually we cope fairly well. The second night, not so well. The third and fourth night, the whole metabolism starts to be disrupted, particularly in a lot of our livestock systems. 4 nights of exposure to really high temperatures in an already stressed animal often leads to mortality. And because we really do disrupt the physiology of that animal. We disrupt the physiology of that animal with exposure to hot nights, that we disrupt fertility cycles. We disrupt milk production, egg production, for disrupting metabolism. Rate of gain goes way down. All of these things are here. Animal cost to animal production with exposure to hot nights is in order of billions every year. And it's hard to get a number on those, but it's really very dramatic. And that's why we've been focusing on this from an animal production side. We've really been looking and saying, how do we begin to characterize these as part of the predictive capabilities? You know, when will these extremes occur, and when will they occur, and how can producers be prepared for that?
Dr. Hatfield?
Yeah.
I've heard the term dark respiration, and,
Yep.
and that, is this similar to that? And they talked about how it was detrimental at high temperatures at night, especially during pollination on corn.
Yeah, in fact, I'll get to that.
Okay.
I have a really cool example for you. Summer temperature changes. You know, as we think about this, as we're talking again, that same thing, but again, it's affecting all the upper Midwest, and by the time we get to the end of the century, it's even more dramatic in terms of the responses. Here's what's happening in the nighttime temperatures. A lot of these things that we talk about in terms of climate change are not, here's 2020, 2025, but in reality, it's already beginning to occur in the climate signal. We already see that. Here's just mean average across the U.S. These are the nighttime temperatures. Projections, the red line is if we've got lots of more CO2, and the blue line is if we have less CO2 going up. The projection is that our nighttime temperatures are going to increase. And in fact, when we've looked at a number of stations across the Midwest, just happens to be Ames, here's what happens. Ames data, since really the mid-19, or about 1990, we do have some variations, but we've been trending up in terms of our nighttime temperatures during that July-August period, June-July-August period, have been increasing about 1.5 degrees per 10 years, which is pretty dramatic in all of this. Part of that's due to the fact that we've become more humid, and so that the increased humidity in the atmosphere is basically increasing our nighttime temperatures. We've got dew points that are we now experience summer dew point temperatures that are in the subtropical to tropical range. And subtropical to tropical is dew point temperatures that are in the upper 70s. And it's not unusual for us to have dew points 78, 79 degrees. That's why we have those heat indices that go to 110, 115 if we've got a hot day out there. It's just darn unpleasant is what it is. But, you know, but that's why we're seeing the night times go up, is because of the water vapor in the atmosphere. It's a cloud effect from a different perspective. Now, let me get to your one other piece of this is that the other aspect of increasing temperature is that we're going to increase crop water demand. Because as we increase the temperature, one of the things that increases is saturation vapor pressure, and that increases the evapotranspiration. So as we increase temperature, crops are going to use water more quickly. And so they're going to use water more quickly, and so if they don't have the water available to them, they're going to undergo water stress. So we're going to see water stress occur more dramatically in all of this. So all of these things are happening. So you've got the increasing nighttime temperatures that do a number of different things to us. We've got the increasing temperatures overall that increase water demand. All of these different pieces. And so we've spent a lot of time looking at temperature effects on plants. And now, here's what happens. In a plant cycle throughout the day, we have respiration, and Dennis mentioned dark respiration. Here's what happens to a plant, is that we have a combination of photosynthesis, which is basically that plant's taking in CO2 out of the atmosphere, it's creating sugars within the leaves. As that sugar is put into that leaf, the respiration process is going on all the time. Our net productivity during a given day is a function of how much photosynthesis we take in and how much respiration did we lose. And so you think about the plant as basically it grows because photosynthesis exceeds respiration. If photosynthesis didn't exceed respiration, you wouldn't have any growth at all. Dark respiration is basically what happens in the dark, and in fact, in a lot of our studies, we go out and measure dark respiration during the day by creating a dark environment. We just put the plant under a big dark canopy, measure how much CO2 is coming off, and that's the respiration rate. Respiration rate is a function of temperature. For every 10 degrees increase in temperature, there's basically a doubling of the respiration rate. So it's going up like this. Here's how dramatic this is. In corn canopies, during the summer, hot nighttime temperatures, CO2 levels during the day above the canopy will be about 300, 290, 300, because that plant's so efficient at taking it out. But in real hot nighttime conditions, because of all that respiration that's going on, it's not unusual to see CO2 concentrations in that corn canopy that go anywhere from 800 to 1,000 parts per million. Almost 3 times what the atmospheric concentration is. And what it does on calm nighttime conditions is it basically creates this pool of CO2 within that canopy. As soon as the sun comes up, it's not safe to be a CO2 molecule around the corn plant, and it's sucked all back in. And so it's just recycled throughout the whole day. But what happens is now if we begin to stress that plant so that that photosynthetic rate doesn't supply enough, it begins to basically, respiration exceeds photosynthesis, and we can start having diminished productivity. That's why we end up with low grain yields in a lot of conditions. The best example of this is 2010, for us anyway. 2010, we had some of our higher nighttime temperatures that we've experienced across the western part of the Corn Belt in here. And that, we were running nighttime temperatures in late August, well, August, September, that were about upper 70s, low 80s every night. And what we did in that year is we shortened the grain filling period by about 8 to 10 days because the plant just basically collapsed at that point. It's also one of the years in which we had some of the lower yields across there. And it's attributable to the fact that basically the respiration rate was exceeding the photosynthetic rate, and we just weren't able to put enough in there. And the plant undergoes some pretty interesting things when it gets to senescence at that level. You'll see some of the senescence indices that we built in part 2 of this. But the dark respiration aspect, and this is why the nighttime temperatures really become very important to us, it's the same thing that happens in animals. Your metabolic rate is a function of temperature, but you do things differently than a plant. A plant's dependent upon air temperature. In a warm-bodied species, we're trying to maintain a core temperature, 98.6 plus or minus 0.2 degrees, depending on individuality. But if you're exposed to really high temperatures, your body still tries to work to maintain that internal core temperature. So think about what you do when you're exposed to high temperatures. What's some of the first things you do?
Drink water.
Drink water. What else?
Shed clothing.
Shed clothing, all right. Anything else?
Sweat.
Sweat. Anything else? What's that?
Turn on a fan.
Turn on, yeah, you can go to evaporative cooling and everything else. The one aspect that also you do is basically you reduce your metabolic input. You quit eating. Because you've got so much energy being generated because of trying to do that. That's why animals go off feed when they get real hot, is because of that they just cannot tolerate the additional energy that's in there. And so that's why we see reductions in milk production, egg production, everything else, is because they've gone off feed because of the metabolic disruption. But because we're so, warm-bodied animals are so intolerant of extremes away from our core temperature, it takes so little to disrupt us. And so when you take an animal and you put them under really high night, particularly the extremes, all of a sudden it's been going along and we jump up everything with an extreme temperature event, which is 5 degrees C more than normal conditions, which is not an unusual event at times, that's why we see collapse of a lot of animal production. We see mortality and all this, because we really try to maintain things in a very narrow range. And if we can't maintain them in a narrow range, it is extremely disruptive to us. We used to think plants were much more tolerant of the temperature extremes than animals because they're responsive to environment and they're following all these different things. What we're beginning to see is that these exposure to high nighttime temperatures not only increases the dark respiration, but that actually it has a negative impact on the photosynthetic rate the next day. The first day we don't see that, but the exposure, it's like animals, the exposure to the second and third day is that we see a decrease in the photosynthetic rate, even though we have ample water and we have adequate sunshine. So we're seeing a disruption of the physiology of this plant in much different ways than we have before. And we've seen this because we have a whole series of measurements that go on that we're measuring the CO2 and water vapor exchange continuously over canopies, and so we can watch these dynamics as we're exposed to this. We have 15 years of data on this, so we can get all the different conditions. So we're beginning to see some of these signals emerge in terms of the different dynamics. And in fact, later on, I'll show you just how dramatic this is in all of this. So I think that we're going to have to understand plant response to some of these changing conditions much different than the way we've been thinking about it in the past. I think that we're going to have to understand some of the physiology of what's going on and how some of these different pieces work in terms of weatherproofing our systems out there. And so it's actually from few viewpoints, it's a very exciting time because we're discovering all sorts of new things. Other viewpoints, it's a real pain in the neck time because we don't understand all those things that are going on to help agriculture cope with very quickly either. But this aspect right here that they talk about is something that, for the life of me, when we talk about temperature effects, this is often the last thing a lot of people think about, is that just changing our temperature increases our rate of water use by the crop. But that's actually the first thing we ought to be thinking about, because we're going to use the water a lot more quickly by that. So that's why it cycles back around to keeping those soils in good shape in all of this. I put this one on here just to remind everybody that growing additional crops is not going to come free. Okay? If we want to grow 300 bushel corn, and that's, there's a lot of producers across the Corn Belt that want to do that. Take that black line, which is our water use efficiency, how much water do we transpire that crop relative to yield. If we want to grow, and that line is fairly linear in this. If we want to grow 300 bushel more corn from where we're at today, it's going to take 5 more inches of water. And I'm going to get 300 bushel corn with no water investment. We may increase some of the tolerance. That plant's going to transpire more water to make that happen. And so I can tell you that in climate change, it's not going to rain 5 more inches during the growing season. We may see some subtle increases. You may have to think about irrigating from a different standpoint, but all of this, and that it becomes a water piece of the puzzle in all of this. And so, these things have to work differently because, and the reason I start with that one is as we transition off to this piece here, is these are the signals that are occurring in our precipitation environment. Winter precipitation is expected to increase, but in reality, we don't get a lot of precipitation over the winter anyway. That's a pretty small amount. So even though we talk about a 10% increase, that's not 10% of a little is still a little. Spring precipitation is actually projected to increase, and so we're going to see a shift in seasonality, a little bit more precipitation. I'll show you some examples of that. Here's the one that concerns me more relative to agriculture, is that across the U.S., long term is that we're going to see a decrease in our summer precipitation. And you think about this, we've built U.S. agriculture on summer precipitation. I mean, all of our cropping systems, everything else has really been based on summer rainfall. And when we see erratic summer rainfall, it's when we see a lot of variation in production. Southern Great Plains, I mean, we're talking some pretty dramatic increases. In fact, some of that's already occurred if you talk to the people in West Texas. I mean, they're in the 5th year way below normal rainfall. The West Coast is predicted to decrease, but that's kind of an anomaly because it's a Mediterranean environment. It doesn't rain there during the summer anyway. And so 0 of 0, or 100% of 0 is still 0. But for us, I think this becomes a very important part of the climate signal that's out there. And then in the fall, the Great Plains are projected to become less rainfall. But again, you look at where we're at, you know, it's not a big rainfall period. But the spring and the summer are the two ones that, from an agricultural perspective, I think we need to be paying attention to. If you look at this, and again, we've looked at this across Iowa and other states in the Midwest, we've already begun to see in the climate signal an increase in spring precipitation, and this is how dramatic it is. And we went back and looked at number of workable field days. That metric that says, that's reported every week, that says how many days were available for field work for each week. And we did an analysis in looking in 1995 to 2010 compared to what it was in 1979 to 1994. And actually, in that latter period from 95 to 2010, we've decreased in that April through mid-May period 3.5 days. We've lost 3.5 days to do field work because we've had more spring precipitation. That's a pretty dramatic change in a 6-week period. And that's why led me to that one statement I talked about yield limitations is inappropriate field practices or agronomic practices. I see a lot of producers going into fields way too early. They're creating sidewall compaction. They're creating some other compaction. I had one producer last year that buried a 48-row planter in the field because it was too wet. Do you know how many tractors it takes to get a 48-row planter unstuck?
Did he get it out in one piece?
Actually, he did. The answer to that question is it takes one more tractor than what he had because they actually had to bring in 2 cargo helicopters to lift it to get it out. And then they bent the frame and he tried to resell it, but nobody wanted to buy it. But you know, and so those are the inappropriate practices, and so we tend to push a lot of our conditions. And so I think we're going to have to be very aware that these changing spring precipitation patterns are going to limit our ability to get some things done that we traditionally did before. And I think we're going to have to be very cautious of the impacts of those decisions. Now I know when we start moving farther west, that becomes less problematic in there, but when we start getting into more and more conservation tillage, wetter soil conditions, it still can become an issue for us in that. So we're trying to expand this whole data set across the Midwest to look at these different things. But these are not projections. This is what's happening in the signal already in this. So we're seeing a shift in seasonality. And we've seen this pretty dramatically across Iowa. Here's the other thing that we've seen. And we just characterize heavy rainfall days as days in which we get more than 1.25 inches per day. The early part of the 20th century, back in the 1900s and 1920, there was only 2 years that had more than 8 days with that level of precipitation. But if you get into the 1980s and beyond, and I need to update this again because I can add 11 and 12 to this, we are now at 9 years in that recent past that we've had years with more than 8 days of 1.25 inches. So we're seeing this change in rainfall intensity on a given day. It's leading us to more erosion, more conditions, and a lot of this is occurring in that early spring condition. So these are things, again, that are occurring in the climate signal as it exists today. They're not projections by 2050, those are reality. And so we're seeing a lot more intense rainfall events. We're seeing a number of those different things that are occurring. There's a slight uptick in terms of precipitation over that same period of time. And again, that's in a shift in seasonality. So it's more spring, less this. That's why we have this dramatic increase in subsurface drainage across the upper Midwest as well. We're draining more land now. In fact, a lot of producers have gone buying their own tiling equipment so they can put in their own tile, because it's about a 2-year wait to get somebody into a field. You know, and so we see that piece of the puzzle as well. Let me also put a different piece of this perspective out there. This happens to be the summer 2012. You know, 2012 was a drought year. We knew it was going to happen, you know, because we do live in a cyclic environment as well. I always found it fascinating in 2012 is the perception was that it was going to be like 1988, last major drought across the U.S. And if you look at 2012 versus 1988, actually the worst year in 2012, these are all the Palmer Z-scores from 1900 to 2012. And this happens to be the 30s, we had some 50s in there. You see a lot of the years. And the reason we put this together is to show people that summer like 2012 is not an anomaly. If you look at this, it does occur, and it occurs in a very widespread range. We need to be prepared for that. All of this, you start looking at, we see all these comings and goings. In fact, it's always fascinating to me. I have this whole other set of statistics we put together looking at billion-dollar losses in agriculture. And it's fascinating to me for the fact that obviously 2012 was an interesting year. We'd made some additional predictions on 2012 that the loss was going to be in the order of about 25 to 30 billion. And we put those numbers together based on some surveys. And we presented that to USDA, and I was told that I couldn't release those numbers because they were just too high. That the actual estimates from USDA were going to be in the order of 12 to 13 billion losses. Just to show you that I never get even with anybody, but the actual number is 32 billion in losses. So I had to go back this last January and say, I told you so.
So where were their figures from?
Well,
You pull them out of the air?
let me just put it out this way, is that there was a lot of perception in 2012 that we did not want to cause a panic in the markets. Because if we come out with an estimate that we're going to have $30 billion of crop loss in total agricultural loss in 2012, corn markets would have been even higher. We would have taken the top off in that. So a lot of our estimates in there.
So they play with the figures, is what you're saying?
Well, you know, yeah. You might want to take that out of you too. I really think that when we look at these things that we need to understand some of the dynamics. In fact, we're still recovering from 2012 and in terms of livestock production. All the herds were sold off, beef prices and everything else. And it takes a long time to recover from beef. And a lot of the areas that were affected in livestock production are still affected in this. So it's a lot of these ripple effects. But you know, a $30 billion loss. But the $1 billion losses, what's fascinating about it from a climate perspective is that we have areas of the U.S. that have $1 billion plus losses because of flooding. And we have $1 billion losses because of dry all in the same year. And so these things are not uniform in terms of the extremes that we have. And we see those extremes occurring more and more all the time in all of this. And I think agriculture is going to have to be prepared for being able to face its extremes in all of this. Precipitation being the major driver and a lot of the reason for the extremes that we see in our environment. The 2012 drought we need to update this one with the 2013 numbers now. But here's the climate impacts from purely a temperature point of view as we go forward. By 2050, is that across the U.S. about a 4% decrease in corn production. Soybeans in the Midwest is actually a winner. It actually will increase in production because it is warmer and a warmer tolerant species, and as the Midwest becomes warmer, that soybean plant will respond quite well, and so is a decrease or an increase. But if you look at soybeans in the South, Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, places where we grow in the Southeast, is actually going to decrease because as that temperature warms, it's now exceeding the optimum of soybeans, and so you're going to see a decrease in productive yields. Wheat, rice, sorghum, cotton, peanuts, beans, they're going to be, if we don't change the environments in which they're growing, or change the region in which they're growing, they're going to show decreases in productivity. And again, a combination of the temperature effect on the growth of the plant and temperature effect on the water use rates by those crops. So, we're going to have to think about agriculture being able to handle some of the changes that are going on out there. And in all of these simulations that we went forward, we did put in projected improvements in genetics every year. We didn't hold the genetics all constant, but actually what improvements we've seen. So these reflect the best of what we see in terms of technology going forward. So it really becomes a very interesting picture. I can do the same thing for vegetables for you. If you look at vegetable production, cool season vegetables will show a decrease in production because, again, a lot of those that grow in early springs have become warmer and everything else. Perennial crops. Perennial crops are a little bit more interesting because perennials a lot of our perennials require chilling hours. They require exposure to low temperatures to be able to set their flowers and everything else. So if it's not cool enough over the winter, then they won't set the number of flowers and number of fruit. The other problem, and I'll give you an example just on apples. Warm temperatures during the apple formation stage is why we end up with a lot of very mushy apples. Apples really like it to be fairly cool during that apple formation stage. And so the higher quality apple comes from the cooler conditions. So warm apples, warm weather means crappy apples, if you think about it from that perspective. Again, the quality aspect of this. Kids are always excited when I tell them that broccoli production will go down with warmer temperatures because they say, well, I don't want to eat broccoli anyway, so if it disappears, it's fine. But, and so the vegetable production is going to be dramatically impacted by some of the temperature responses. Just give you an example of this. This happens to be U.S. corn, soybean, and wheat production. And this is aggregate national statistics, so it gets more dramatic at the state level. U.S. corn production, very interesting part of this whole dynamic. From about 50 through about 1970, we have a little increase in production as we had across there. But what's interesting about that is very little variation about that line. Weather was extremely stable in the 50s and 60s until we saw a little weather variation. When we moved into this period of the 70s through the 1990s, that we had a lot more variation from year to year. We went back into a smaller period in which we had little weather variation, and now we're going to go back into a period in which I think we'll see a lot of extremes in our productivity levels, just because of the weather variation that's out there. Soybeans actually show a lot more variation than does corn production from year to year. And again, yield formation in soybeans occurring really late in the growing season. And where we see a lot of our water stresses is that late summer rainfall pattern where we hit or miss across the U.S. is why we see that variation occurring. And we see that dramatic drop in 2012. Wheat production, again, variations from year to year, going back and forth. Different periods of time in which we've had stability in production, again, because of the different regions of the country in all of this. I just want to point out a couple examples because they've been extremely fascinating to me. This is 2010 corn production areas in the U.S. The dramatic change in corn production into North Dakota and South Dakota in 2010 as opposed to what it was in 2000. This is western march of corn and soybeans. In fact, we went back and looked at this. This is the South Dakota area harvested. That dashed line is soybeans. How rapidly soybeans took off in South Dakota since about the 80s. Wheat production, corn production in there. You see corn production still increasing in all of this, displacing wheat and sunflower production. North Dakota, little increase, still major in wheat, but corn and soybeans starting to take off, and that's on the whole statewide average. In individual counties, it becomes more dramatic. And the reason I point this out is not for you all, but to dispel a lot of the perception that people have that climate is going to change to a certain point and then we'll see a change in agriculture. Agriculture is constantly changing relative to the types of conditions that are out there. People are always surprised at these. What do you mean it's changed? I mean, we see this expansion, contraction of areas. Producers, you're watching this as much as anybody, taking advantage of all this. I attribute, and you can tell me if I'm right or wrong, I attribute to the change in corn production and soybean production across North Dakota, South Dakota, to really a number of different factors. One has been, it's warmed enough so there's a little longer growing season. There's been a little increase in summer precipitation, so it's become just a little bit more stable precipitation actually compared to what it was before. The other one is the widespread adoption of conservation tillage, so you really made very good use of what water's there, snow capture, a number of different things. The two other reasons become much more interesting. One is low cash rents compared to what it is in the Corn Belt, so you don't have to grow 200 bushel corn to get break even. And high prices of corn and soybeans haven't hurt either. And so those factors are the ones that really drive this change in expansion. If rainfall becomes much more erratic, it'll retreat back to the east side of the Red River. But we see all these different changes that are going on, and agriculture has changed and adapted to the climate for the last 7,000 years. And we're going to continue to adapt and change relative to climate in the next 7,000 years. And so it's not a matter that the climate's going to get to this point and then we're going to make this change. All these things are going to happen constantly as we go through this. So we just take corn production and break it out to show you, and again, it's not so much for you all, but for other people, is that here's what weather cost us. I mean, here's the drought, and this is some of our historical data. 30% yield losses, 26%. The blight year, which everybody thought was bad, was still only an 18% compared to some of our weather events that are out there. The wet spring, early frost cost us 16%. We just had some other, 93 of that's a flood year as well. I can throw the 2012 on there now because that was about a 28% reduction from projected yield curves. So you see all these different things, and so a lot of this is really to begin to prep our understanding of what we're going to have for production. Just take you through some scenarios of climate impacts on agriculture, and then we'll stop. I looked at a lot of different crops. I probably spend more time in the NASS database looking at yield trends than the NASS people themselves. Alfalfa production in Kansas, just looking at this, in fact, we see a pretty interesting pattern in that we've been trying to figure out what's going on in this. Again, it's rain-fed agriculture, not dryland. I use this one as an example that everybody says, well, we can solve all our climate problems if we irrigate. And I use Kansas as an example because you can easily separate the eastern half of the state, which is rain-fed, versus the western half, which is irrigated. The lower graph is the irrigated or non-irrigated yields or rain-fed. This is the irrigated. You see there's a different yield trend out there, but there's still variation about that line because irrigation doesn't solve all your production problems. A lot of these are related to high temperature events that occur during pollination. This is just erratic rainfall in all of this. So we see all those different pieces of the puzzle. We see a lot of different things. We've done some other things actually in counties, multiple county yields, doing a different analysis. This upper line is we do analysis on an upper quadrant analysis, and we'll talk about it later. But here's the bottom line of this one. When we've done those county yields and we've looked at this production estimates, is that we basically relate how much yield we've lost to what the potential would be for that particular year out there. We find out that 20% of our yield loss is occurring 80% of the time, and it's really due to water availability. And the reason that becomes a very important number, at least to me, is that when we talk about 20% of our yield loss occurring 80% of the time, that is really within somewhat of our management capabilities. If we are down in this part of the curve, when we're talking about 40 to 50 to 60%, these are the years that everything just really fails. But these are years in which, and when we went back and analyzed that, is that these are short-term stresses. We needed an inch of rainfall, but we only got a half inch. Boy, it would have been good to have that rain today, but it really didn't rain for another 3 days. And so these are the short-term stresses that if we had the water holding capacity and the water storage within that soil, we would have taken this part of the curve and moved it up a little bit. And so the reason I'm excited about this part is this is within our management capabilities. Not that we'll take all that out, but I think we can take some of that out because of field variation, looking at a number of different puzzles. And so this is the aspect I think we need to think about. Where do we lose our yield? How do we cope with these short-term stresses as part of this puzzle that's out there? And you'll see that when we talk about the weatherproofing part of this system. So here's what we know. We know that climate is changing. We know it's impacting production. We know it's impacting distribution. We know that climate variation is going to continue to increase. The extremes are going to become more extreme, both on the cold and the wet and the dry and the hot side. They're going to further affect our production. They're going to spread that curve out unless we really think about doing something. And so when in part two, we're really going to talk about weatherproofing our farming systems. How do we bring this together? Because to me, that's the fascinating piece of this. That you and I are not going to control the weather. At least I don't know that anybody has that capability yet. And we're going to have to understand how do we really manage our systems both from a genetic side and from a management side to cope with this environment that's in the middle. And to me, that becomes the interesting puzzle of how do we put this together. And weatherproofing doesn't mean bulletproofing. What it means in that curve is making basically, that 20% yield loss maybe down to a 10% yield loss or something. We're doing all of this or taking some of those extremes out of that curve as we go forward. So with that, that's kind of part one. I think that's the last slide. And this one? Yep. So we'll talk about this. Gives you.
Jerry, maybe we should take a break now?
Yeah, that's what we're going to do.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
I was going to give them a chance to say rock stones, questions, tomatoes. That's why I wear a red sweater. Tomato stains don't show as much.
Obviously, we are having more variation in our weather, and I'm just curious, and for your comment on this, the projections far out that you were showing us as far as the world, climate change, and our temperature changes, and climate changes, is that based on, and maybe this is just an academic question, I don't know, because like I say, we are definitely seeing weather, climate change. Is that based on CO2 increase because of humans or because of natural? Or some of each? I mean, there are the two camps. One says, well, it's all human caused, and one said, some of the scientists say, no, it's natural. And I tend to follow the ones that say natural, because if we go far enough back, we would have been under probably 20 foot of ice here at one time. We would have gone that far back.
Yeah, I think central Iowa is a few more feet than that.
Okay.
Yeah. Des Moines Lobe at one time, there was supposed to have been a mile thick of ice across that. We're a few feet short of that this year. Although it seems like it. The fact that the whole aspect of climate change, in my opinion, we've made much too polarized in terms of our discussion. It seems that you either have to be that climate change is entirely man-induced, or your climate change is all natural causes. And I think in reality, we have climate change that has occurred for centuries. I mean, we've always lived in a changing climate. There has been no such thing as stable climate. The climate's always been changing. My personal opinion is that for man to assume that we can basically control the weather by our actions is a little arrogant. And it's arrogant from this viewpoint. The energy that's contained in the atmosphere far exceeds any of the energy we produce by the total of what we burn with fossil fuels, what we burn with our cars, what we burn with everything else. And so we may contribute to some of this variation by the things that we do, and a lot of that may be due to what we do in creating heat island effects with our cities, what we do with a lot of our disruptions of the natural environment that's out here by all of this that causes this. But I don't think we have completely disrupted the whole climate cycle by our activities, because it's just too powerful an engine in all of this. And I think that you look at this signal that's occurring out there, and part of our discussion, in my opinion, is that we tend to focus too much on the short term rather than the really long term. If you look at the really long term, we have had temperatures much higher than what they are today and what we're even projecting. We've had CO2 levels back in the dinosaurs, back in some of the, when we formed all this nice oil and coal and everything else, we had some tremendous CO2 levels just based on the amount of plant activity that was there and everything else. So I mean, we pumped a lot of that into the earth, and we reap that today. And does it say that we shouldn't be prepared for climate change? No. I think in agriculture, we really need to be prepared for these increasing extremes. I mean, one of the things that we're looking and seeing in the climate signal is that we're projected to have hotter, drier summers. And I think it really behooves us in agriculture saying, how do we adapt our cropping systems to handle hotter, drier summers? You know, do we think about growing different crops? We do a number of different things. I'll tell you some of those stories in the next section as well. I think it's a matter of getting prepared for how we're going to handle climate variation. And that's the piece that's out there. You know, it just really becomes a very fascinating topic, but the whole politics of the thing is quite bizarre in a lot of cases. All right, break time.
Yeah.